This Raw Green episode is brought to you by Obi, a sustainability consultancy firm specialized in life cycle assessment and decarbonization strategies. For more information, check oneobi.com or visit our page on social media. Links in the description. I am Francesco De Lieto. I am passionate about sustainability and green techs. Welcome to a new episode of Raw Green. Awareness of environmental impacts of the food we eat is definitely on the rise. We know, for example, that animal meat, especially beef, has a particularly high environmental impact, while vegetables generally have much lower emissions. But what about all the new foods we hear about? Think about plant based meat, insects, or cultivated meat. Some of these foods are now part of our diets and widely available around the world. Some are very close to commercialization, and others are at different stages of research and development. What they all have in common is the promise that every kilogram of these products will have a lower environmental impact than conventional options. The question is, what if we change the angle and ask, if we study the environmental impacts from a nutritional standpoint rather than per kilogram of product, would they still have lower environmental impacts? To help answer this question, we have today's guest. She is an expert on food systems with a specific focus on novel foods, their sustainability, and their environmental impacts. Welcome, Dr. Rachel Mazac.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Thank you for being here, Doc. And can you please, let's start. Can you please let us know a bit more about yourself, your expertise, and area of research?
Sure, yes. I am currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Center in Stockholm, Sweden. And some of my current work is with Dr. Lynn Gordon, and we're looking at food futures and sustainable food futures and how we can get there. Some of that work is through dietary modeling, through food systems modeling and assessment, and looking at various pathways for possible, plausible, positive food futures. And then my previous work in my doctoral degree was at the University of Helsinki with Dr. Hanna Tuomisto, and I focused more specifically on these novel and future foods, we called them, or these diversifying food options for kind of as alternates to some of the, as we are becoming more aware of the resource intensive, high impact and resource intensive foods, such as kind of the animal source foods that we know.
Okay, nice. All right, very focused. And let's talk. That's how we got in contact. Let's talk about your research on novel foods. Can you please give us an overview? What is it about?
So we have been looking at trying to assess, as you said, some of the potential of these foods to help us meet our sustainability and, in particular, our environmental impact goals or ways to reduce our environmental impacts of the food system in general. So, the background to that is, as maybe many people know, the food system on a global level is one of our largest anthropogenic sources of greenhouse gas emissions. It's a significant use, at least 70% of our significant use of resources, so 70% of deforestation is said to be caused by agricultural production. Huge swaths of habitable land, about half of our habitable land is used for agricultural production, and huge proportions of our water use as well. So this is clearly an activity that on the planet is using a lot of our resources, and it's something that is to keep in mind that we have a budget for these resources. So it's not as if we shouldn't be spending maybe half of our, say, land use budget on food production because people need to eat. But the fact is that we're actually well exceeding what the planet can withhold for our current and future kind of generations. health and well-being as well as for the planet. And not in particular, not to mention the biodiversity impacts of the agricultural production system, which have yet to be kind of exactly quantified, but are also exceeding our planetary boundaries. So, anyway, that's the background to why we've been looking at trying to find ways to mitigate, to change our food systems and better provide options for healthy and sustainable diets, which are inherently also healthy because that's an important piece of the food system.
Yeah.
So looking at that, we took the kind of one sub direction of what if we focused on what people are eating. Now, I don't want to overemphasize the fact that it's not only what people are eating, but it's how that's being produced, how it's being processed, all these other pieces along the food system that are important. But our angle is looking at diets. What is it that people are consuming on a daily, yearly, weekly basis, and how does that have an impact, and how can we reduce those impacts through the consumption side? So again, not to overly burden just a consumer on what they're eating is the important piece, but it's an aspect of the food system that should change. So, in knowing that, we also understand that it's the often the animal source foods are these highly impactful or resource intensive foods, particularly as you had mentioned, beef, other ruminants like sheep, and as well as our pork and poultry production and dairy and cheese as well. So these are impactful, though important parts of our diet. So we're trying to find ways to look at how do we change, what do we have as other options, how do we find alternatives, and there are different emerging pathways. So our understanding was if we're looking at these different pathways, what are the various options for kind of transition? And some of these might be the more kind of novel technologies like cellular agriculture, precision fermentation, to try to create food items that are organoleptically or sensorially similar to what people are used to, say, trying to recreate a ground beef or a hamburger patty. Or then it might be the more plant based, where we're taking kind of plant ingredients, processing them in a certain way, and creating a familiar, also maybe a patty or kind of a nugget or something like this. Maybe it's
Hmm.
a plant based milk drink, and then or just kind of whole grain legumes, as well as also our blue food options. So that might be mussels, kelp, microalgae, some of these things. So we looked at these pathways and we tried to understand how those possible food items could be a part of a sustainable diet. In our sustainability terms, we're looking at, well, are they healthy and nutritious, and then do they have lower environmental impacts, and how do we have diets that do that?
Nice. And among the seven novel foods, we have some that I have to be honest with you, I never heard before. Uh,
Mm.
we have culture meat, cellular meat. We have oval booming. We have microbial protein, insects.
Hmm.
We have
Mm.
microalgae. We have kelp and mycoprotein. Those in your research, those are the seven that are classified as novel foods. My question is A, what are oval booming, microbial protein, and mycoprotein? And where do I find them?
Mm.
In what I find them?
Right. Yeah. Yes. So this is by no means an exhaustive list of some of these options. We were looking
Mm.
at kind of categories more or less and understanding what are the possibilities and prospects of kind of existing or nearly exist, near future, near kind of
They're
just around the
ready to,
corner
yeah.
food items.
Okay.
Yeah, right, exactly. So that's where some of these food items came from. There's also been a few other studies trying to do some categorization and classification of these novel or future foods. Now, we use novel kind of broadly in the sense of is a novel technology, perhaps some of these emerging pieces like cellular agriculture or precision fermentation, or novel culturally in terms of, say, insects is maybe a more culturally novel for Western diets, not necessarily for many other places around the world, but
True.
in particular for maybe North American and European kind of conventional diets. So those were our kind of classifications, or future in the sense that there's a possibility for them to increase in their demand and their production in the future, and a possibility to meet those future sustainability goals. So kind of looking at that realm. And so then to answer your question, um, we so maybe you've heard of cellular meat or lab grown meat. That one's kind of maybe more in the realm of people's awareness, but less so perhaps is something like the microbial protein, as you pointed out, or the ovalbumin. So those are both other optional kind of emerging or existing technologies to produce proteins, we would
Protein.
say. I don't
Mm.
like to focus only on proteins because I think the diet consists of much, much more than that, but to produce food options that can help us either mimic or get to nutritious food items that mimic what we want. So ovalbumin, for example, is egg white. It's trying to make an egg white
Okay.
like product, and it is produced through what is called acellular fermentation, and that is it's where the cells are producing the product that we would like to consume. So there's cellular fermentation, where the cells grown in a lab, often, they could say cultured in then made in bioreactors, almost like a type of fermentation, like making a large vat of beer or say pickles of some kind. That cellular fermentation in that we're going to directly consume those cells that are being produced. And then there's acellular fermentation where we're going to produce the product of those cells that so in this case, the cells, the microbes, create an egg white like protein that we would use then in food products
And
or to be
number of
consumed
products.
directly as an ingredient. Exactly. So there's a number of ingredients. A number of food products have, say, egg white as an ingredient, and you can mix those or add this into instead of using the egg whites themselves.
Okay.
So that's that one. Then there's microbial protein, which is produced through precision fermentation, which is another type of, it's similar, but a technology that then we are more using consuming the microbes themselves. And in this case, it would be kind of coming out like a protein powder. Maybe you'd mix this into a protein shake or, some of the, or you could mix it into breads or other materials. I guess you could eat it plain, but not a lot of folks are just spooning in whole mouthfuls of protein powder. But yeah, so those are those pieces. And then I think you mentioned mycoprotein, which is
Yes.
a product that has existed for some time. Maybe folks know the brand name Quorn,
Oh yeah,
Quorn,
of course.
and it is a fungi or a mushroom based product that actually also uses egg white in it. So it's not vegan, but it's generally vegetarian. And that one's been, at least out of the UK for some time, has been sold and consumed
Oh
quite
yeah, 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 yeah.
readily
But
for some time now.
it's got very wide distribution, retail distribution. Yeah,
Mm,
it's pretty much everywhere.
exactly.
Okay, very interesting. Now let's go to the results of your study, and I want to tell you the, let's say, among the different impact categories that you selected in your study. Let's say the final, the grand total of the impacts resulted in having the top three least impactful items, that are the microbial protein, the insect meal, and the fava. While the worst three are the sausage, fish, which was a little bit of a surprise, not too much, just a little surprise, and, ladies and gentlemen, beef, the worst among
Mm, mm.
among all of the food analyzed. So let me break it down, because there are a few surprises that I was not expecting, and that's the beauty of the doing an LCA. There is always a surprise coming out. So the global warming potential of microalgae and mycoprotein. Why? Because the first time I studied microalgae was when they were put into a bioreactor to absorb CO2, or they perhaps used to make biodiesel. And to see them with a high global warming potential, it was a little bit of a surprise. Can you please tell me why?
Yes, so you're referencing the study that we were looking at these various, I guess we call them protein sources, but food items in a meal. So this study looks at kind of foods in situ or in context in which we would be eating them. So we don't eat foods just as individual ingredients. Most often we'll eat them as a part of a meal or at least across the average of a day as a whole diet. So in this case, we wanted to understand if we incorporated these various products from the animal source foods, the plant based protein rich foods. So that's fava bean, that's tofu, and then also these more novel and future foods, as we've been talking about, if we incorporated them into a meal and it's the same meal, but we change only this kind of protein source, how do they compare across six environmental impacts? And then across, if we took those environmental impacts and aggregated them into a single score, an impact score, and then also put that in terms of their nutritional kind of contribution to that meal or to that diet for an individual. Because I guess if you're looking at LCA, a functional unit can be chosen based on many different kind of uses of a product. And in this case, we eat food most often to provide nutrition or energy and intake of particular foods, right? So we compare them both on a mass basis, and that's where you see the individual impacts. That's in terms of per unit mass, or we say 100 grams, or the amount needed for that meal, a serving size, let's say. And then you have the nutritional piece that comes in kind of secondary, which we can get to that. But if you're looking at just the global warming potential, or that's say the climate impact measured in carbon dioxide equivalents, you see that, yeah, we were ranking them. And so this isn't an absolute difference, this is more a relative difference. But you can see that when you compare these kind of 14 different options that we were looking at in this study, beef comes out in last place, 14th, and then you see microprotein and microalgae. So those particular food items are, in my understanding, we needed quite a bit of them to kind of replace the requisite amount of, say, protein, energy, fat we were trying to replace in the food item. So they're very low fat and kind of dense, maybe calorically dense food items, also protein dense. So it's just that you needed quite a bit of them, and in that
To
case,
reach
you
target.
see based
Yeah.
on mass that they have a higher impact than some of the other options, say chicken and fish and sausage, which kind of come ranked above that for climate impact. So that's kind of maybe that reason.
And that's the angle that gives, right? That's sort of the results they give by looking at things from a different angle, which is the nutritional standpoint. Very, very, very interesting. Another question that I
Right.
have: land use, um,
Mm.
more specifically for cultured meat. Now, the whole reason of having cultured meat, it is, besides obviously animal well-being, it is because intensive animal raising, intensive cattle fields, they are devastating
Mm.
for the environment. How come that there is uh, such a high result on land use in culture meat?
Yes, this is an interesting question and quite something that we're digging into more. And when we get into the details that you can see in an LCA, that inventory data, you can really pull out some of these pieces. So I also have to say that there are many different types of, let's say, conventional beef production. So there are the extensive that would use quite a bit of land, but have other benefits, say, to biodiversity, to animal welfare, and ethics perspectives, as well as rural livelihood. So from a sustainability standpoint, there's kind of other benefits to extensive farming, and then there's the intensive farming systems for beef and livestock, which have other impacts. But irregardless, beef still generally comes out as a very conventional beef still comes out as a generally very high land use activity, because you need to grow a lot of crops. Mostly it's the crops to feed the livestock themselves. And whether that's on grass pasture, still requiring land, or whether those crops are grown in a kind of a feed crop system and then fed into as feed concentrates, grains to the livestock themselves, who aren't out on pasture, that still requires a lot of land. So that's where it comes into beef. And I just want to emphasize there are many different types of production there, as well as then we're comparing that to, so let's say, the equivalent, or what's attempting to be the equivalent product, which would be the cultured meat. You can see that it actually has quite a bit of land use, and you wonder, okay, well, where is that coming from? There's no pasture. These are cells grown in a lab, right?
Yeah.
And it has other benefits. We can see there's a reduction often in say water use, and certainly in climate or carbon impact. But yeah, the land comes out as still a quite a high impact. And what we're seeing there, when you look into the inventory data, is actually when you're creating these cellular agriculture products, they still require inputs. Of course, they're not drawn out of nothing. So in order to culture these cells, you have to use a medium, they say a nutrient medium that these are grown in, and the cells need to eat something, and often that limiting piece is in the form of is sugars, more or less. And in this
Mm.
case, the say one of the main ingredients in this nutrient medium is glucose, and that glucose has to come from somewhere. And in our current systems, I guess we're not producing cellular meat at scale, so this could quite change where we're getting these pieces from. And in a different future system, we could look at how we're getting this glucose. But at the moment, the way
The
glucose is
feed.
produced is through
Yeah.
hydrolyzed wheat, or
Mm.
yeah, through corn, let's say maize production in North
Okay.
America at least,
Which is
or sugar beet
associated
production.
to land use change.
Yeah,
Yes.
which has quite a high land use
Yeah.
just to start with,
Mm.
because we're producing crops. So it's kind of hidden in the background data that you
Yeah.
don't quite see. That well, you don't think that there are crops being fed to livestock. No, but there are still actually quite a bit of land that is required for these cellular products. It's just another way of. So if your goal is to not feed crops that we to say livestock or to produce like meats to a bioreactor or to an animal, but instead to a non-human animal, but instead to eat them ourselves, you're not really circumventing that issue. You're just changing to whom you're feeding the same crops to. So if instead humans were to eat the glucose or energy, say in wheat or in corn directly, that's that's kind of reduces that impact, and it just like reduces the efficiency by putting that same product through a bioreactor to create cellular meat or through a cow to create beef. There are other say nutritional benefits. I said there are differences of course in nutrition for in comparison, just like 100 grams of wheat and 100 grams of beef, of course. But yeah, that's just part of the equation there that we're looking at.
Nice. Okay. Another question. For insect meal, why it is so high on marine eutrophication?
Yeah, we see across some of the other impacts that we were looking at that insects, and in this case we do insect meal, so it's sort of a powder that's comparable to the other products.
Like a flour, right?
It
Yeah.
yeah, sort of like a powder, a flour, one of these protein kind of additives ingredients, so it's more comparable. And we across the other impacts, we see insects actually ranking quite high as a protein source. But yeah, when we're looking at in particular, the marine eutrophication, I think what we're seeing there is the still required feed again that goes to feed. If you look at insects as
Okay.
little livestock, there's still a practice of needing to feed them, of course. And though they might use less land because they require or we are willing to subject them to different conditions than we are chickens, pork, or cattle, they still require feed inputs. So in this case, my understanding is that you're seeing a lot of the marine eutrophication coming from the feed concentrates that would currently be fed to, well, either here you see beef ranked last or then insect meal ranked the second to last, which still
Yeah.
has quite a bit of eutrophication potential to marine systems.
Yeah. Definitely. Okay. Another question. Told you I had many. So
Yes, great.
chicken.
Keep them coming.
Okay. This basically you already partially answered this question before, but I have chicken, mycoprotein, microalgae, and fish that consumes more water than beef. Okay, in the results.
Mm.
And is this like you said for other let's say impacts because of to reach that amount of kilocalories, since you have that target nutritional value per day, RDA per day, is it because to reach that you will need more of it?
That's more or less how it's coming out. So again, our functional unit for comparison of these kind of rankings, as you see, and as you point out, that these four food items, chicken, microalgae, microprotein, and fish, all have higher water use than the beef, and we don't often see that. But we don't see that when we're looking at just in terms of pure mass, so 100 grams of each of these products compared to each other. But in this case, we're looking at them in situ again, that is, as consumed in a meal. So this does take into consideration the fact that in order to reach that same amount of micro or macronutrients, we were looking at kind of that's calories, fat, protein, and fibers, these things. That is, in order to reach that same amount in this meal that we were looking at, you need to have. It turns out that these, on a relative basis, these four food items actually have more water use for that particular meal.
Okay. So, can we say then, generally speaking, uh, looking at the environmental impacts from a nutritional perspective, is it correct to assume then plant-based ones, so the old-fashioned vegetables, foods
Mm.
are better than novel foods?
Well, yeah, I mean, it really does depend on what your goals are. But in this study, we did find that comparing these six environmental impacts individually and then in aggregate, and then kind of the final piece that maybe we haven't yet touched on really is this last step that looks at all the impacts, so the aggregated impacts, then put in terms of this nutrient rich food index. So that's the amount of like the nutritional contribution that each of these food items has to this meal. And put in those terms kind of across the board, in individual impacts, aggregate, and then this last kind of score, we called it a nutritionally invested environmental impact. So that's, again, the impacts in terms of their nutritional contribution. You see that the plant based, protein rich foods like fava beans, tofu, and a plant based meat imitate product really rank across the board higher than the animal source foods for sure, and more often than not, higher than some of these novel or future foods that we're looking at. So if you're looking at these six impacts and the nutritional contribution of these food items and comparing these, yes, you see that the plant-based protein-rich options tend to perform better or rank higher in terms of performance than the uh, animal source foods for sure, and then some of the novel foods. So there's that piece, and really the kind of summative score here, this nutritionally invested environmental impact score, shows us kind of the how the rankings really play out. So that is, if these food items are to have the same nutritional contribution in this meal, and we're looking at the impacts, yeah, our plant-based options rank very, very highly in comparison to most of the other novel and future foods. So that's kind of, but again, if you have other sustainability goals that you're trying to meet, maybe that's also cultural appropriateness, maybe that's some acceptability, maybe it's affordability for sure, maybe it's ethics and welfare. I guess you'd have to think about these food items in other terms. So I just also want to say that these were the six impacts and the nutrition that we looked at. It wasn't a full sustainability assessment, but in this case, they seem to rank quite well.
Yeah, there is also that adoption part, that it is kind of important, because it is, let's say, the trigger
Mm,
that can give scale economy in production. I mean, I'm fascinated by the culture meat, to be honest with you, because you will be able to uh, solve so many issues that there are with intensive farming, starting by uh, almost completely cancel the use of antibiotics,
mm,
to obviously being able to produce locally, because you could have the manufacturer plant distributed in various locations across any countries, and that would basically shorten supply chains a lot, because there's also the downstream part of the emissions that, especially
mm,
for animal protein, requires is a cold chain. So that there's also, it's usually not much. It is between 4 to 10% of their overall emissions in a life cycle, but still, it is a lot when you sum
mm,
them all together. And I was looking at a documentary a while ago, and they were talking about, it was a little bit like rocket science, some things, like crazy science. Sorry. Some they were thinking about reviving like dinosaur meat, which seems a little bit far
Mm.
fetched.
Hmm.
Why are you thinking about that too?
I'm thinking about if just because we can do it, we should ask ourselves, should we do it?
Should
But
we do
yeah.
it? Exactly, exactly. Fair point. But what was even more interesting was that you can, now I don't know how safe it is, but assume it is. You can tailor, let's say, the growing patterns and the formula in a way to give a predetermined amount of nutrients, whether it is protein, whether it is fat. You can engineer that. You can tailor that final kilogram of cultivated meat, which is also very important, because that will also means that you are able to regulate the pricing of that meat, which is, especially beef, it is expensive. And projection are that in by 2040 the consumption of beef will double at the current rate, which is, as you mentioned rightfully before, we have a budget on our natural resources, and we are already way out of budget. So that is a
Indeed.
very important part, I think. I want to ask you, among all these novel foods, now I told you mine, which is the cultivated meat, what I think can have,
Hmm.
let's say, the biggest impact from different angles, which is the adoption part, which is the environmental impacts saving part, and also the nutritional part. What do you think? Which one do you think it is going to be playing an important part, and why?
Oh, which of the kind of foods that we studied, which of the novel foods?
Which are
Yeah.
novel foods? Yes.
Yeah. Looking at all of these. Yes, I do want to answer that question, but I actually also want to comment a little bit on the your overview on cellular meat or lab grown meat. And I think that you rightfully make a lot of points that there's, from, as I was saying before, from this sustainability as a holistic lens, there are quite a few benefits to cellular agriculture that we aren't seeing, or that we would try to mitigate from, say, conventional beef production. And yes, you would see huge implications for animal welfare, let's say. Again, the conditions which we're willing to subject cells to are quite different than perhaps the conditions that we're willing to subject livestock or non-human animals to. So there's that piece, as well as as you well point out, the antibiotic use and the antimicrobial and like antibiotic resistance would be a completely different story, because we wouldn't be feeding them in such quantities to have the livestock being produced at such a volume that we want in an industrial scale. We wouldn't be using those pieces. Um, and we also would see huge changes in that. Let's imagine a world in which a lot of this, say, meat, beef production, cellular production is being done in, as you projected, a localized kind of a bespoke fermentery, and we could each have one
Mm,
in a small town or on farms. And some of my colleagues in Finland were looking very much at, well, what if like farmers who are farming kind of in our conventional systems today were to transition to these types of systems. And there's a lot of different benefits there. Some farmers are quite interested in that, some not so much. But there's still certainly that prospect of relocalization. And even if you're, the way our food systems should be changing in some ways is also to say, if beef in any way, whether cellular or not, is being produced in a location, it should be, being produced by the crops
consume
and food
locally.
available
Yeah.
there and to the people whom are there, right? And right
Hmm.
now, our food system is so globalized, and basically we're, as you say, beef is expensive, but it's actually not as expensive as it maybe should be due to the external environmental cost, and of course to the animal
Sure.
welfare, let's say. And that's not just beef, but that's the other animal source foods. So I think we have to keep those things in mind, that there's actually a lot of background subsidies, taxes,
Oh,
interconnect, like kind of the way
yeah.
our food system is interconnected right now, and the way our subsidy system is set up, is that all of those impacts that we're seeing right now are external to the cost of the food item, more or less. And if we were to internalize those costs, let's say having it would increase the cost, particularly of beef, quite a bit. And so I think there would be a round there for adjusting that. And we might see that differently if we were to price cellular agriculture in those terms, as well as to try to internalize those costs. And clearly we would see conventional beef production as being much higher in terms of that. So there's those pieces. But that kind of is some broad overview. And then you also ask quite another important question of kind of what is the culturally relevant need for these food items, and that broadens the other point to your question, which is which of these novel foods that we looked at actually was doing quote the best, or which one might be the best. And I again, I was we were looking at specifically these impacts, and we were looking at them in these meals. And I think what does need to be asked is what we're willing to prioritize first. If your priority is to reduce environmental impacts and still have a nutritious food item, the microbial protein and the insect meal came out on top kind of irregardless,
Mm,
if that was your goal. And then you can also see the plant-based alternatives, so the fava beans, the tofu, as well as the kelp. So we didn't talk so much about seaweeds or
yeah.
microalgae and kelp being the kind of macro algae eaten as a seaweed, or a dried powder as well. Those score kind of quite highly again in terms of these impacts and these um, and the nutritional composition. And we had one other article that we looked at using at the whole diet perspective. So it wasn't just a meal, but it was what someone would consume in a day. And instead of us making the choices as to how much of these food items should be in a meal, we let a mathematical model, an optimization model, decide for us how much of these different food items should be, quote unquote, should be in a diet in a day. And the optimization was to minimize individually the carbon, the water use, and carbon impact, the water use, and the land use. And if you look at those individually, you also allow, let's say we allowed this model, we try to make as few decisions as possible as modelers, as researchers, and let the model do the work, make the decisions. And if you allow it to choose among these novel future and plant-based foods that we've been discussing, as well as the conventional animal source foods, you see a very significant, almost 100% reductions from current levels of intake for dairy, animal fats, red meats, poultry, etc., eggs. And you see, of
Wow.
course, an increase from current, because we're not really currently consuming these foods, but you see on a mass per grams per day basis that again insect meal. And actually we looked at cultured milk as well, and cultured milk being kind of another cultured product, and acellular, that means we're consuming the cells that are being produced the the cellular agriculture. Then we see these food items actually being selected in this diet optimization. So if you're looking at that again, that's another angle to say, okay, this is maybe which is performing the best, which is mathematically speaking, again, comparing these impacts and meeting our nutritional goals, our dietary intakes for a day. These food items do tend to come on top. But again, if you're looking at other sustainability pieces, will people consume them? That's something we didn't look at in these studies, but an important feature. Can people afford these food items? And
Yeah.
that's
It's
again,
a
we
very
didn't
good
look at that
point.
directly, but is an important piece. And that, again, we have to be fair to, if we internalized the costs, or if we had internalized the cost of beef, that would be quite higher, quite much higher than it is today. And if we also were to grow, say, cellular beef, cellular meat at scale, it might be much lower than it is today. So this does have different kind of considerations to take into account when we're trying to say, well, quote, which is best. And I think that the answer might be that there isn't just one best option, but there will need to be multiple different and plural pathways for people to try to meet their dietary needs, their cultural preferences, as well as the maybe the common goal, which is to stay within our sustainable boundaries, within our sustainable planetary boundaries. So we're all going to have to make some decisions, but we don't have to all make the same decision in order to, to change dietary practices. And again, I don't, as I started with, I don't want to overemphasize the kind of burden to be placed only on the individual or on consumers, because I think from a systems perspective we need to make many changes. And that's from the production side. That's, of course, we need to reduce food loss and waste. We need to
Yeah.
stop overly like surplus production, in a way that we are allowed to more or less waste the food that we're overproducing in many ways. So there's a lot of other considerations that need to be made as well. It's do we need to change our diets? Yes, of course. But do we all need to do it in the same way? No. And is that the only thing that needs to change? No, by no means.
There are so many things that can be done from the very beginning throughout transportation, consumption, and end of life of that. The other day, I received a pack of chicken breast, free range chicken breast.
Mm,
And Rachel, I mean, I was so angry. There were six chicken breasts individually wrapped in plastic. I wanted to kill them.
mm,
The
mm.
genius that decided that that was a good idea.
Not the chickens. The chickens are already dead, right? But the packagers.
No, get the packagers,
Yeah,
but the guy that
exactly. The
decided
people who made the decision to put them individually wrapped. Yeah.
for six chicken breasts, let's use 7 bags of
Mm.
plastic to
Yep.
transport this thing. I really anyway. Don't let me start to swear.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a feature though that's I mean, go ahead. It's very frustrating. I think that's a feature of a food system that also tries to meet a goal that we end up having other again these externalities. So to try to meet the goal of a hygienic and clean and safe food system, which we should be. We don't want to eat chicken with salmonella, then there's a solution along that pathway to have that goal of a safe and nutritious food item is to wrap it individually. But what it does is it has this other externality of increasing plastics use and increasing plastic packaging waste there in other kind of downstream effects of that. So
yeah,
we I think that's another
another episode.
indication of how we need to be thinking more systemically about these solutions, quote unquote. So we shouldn't jump off the deep end like a bunch of lemmings and say let's all go for cell ag, let's all go for whatever the novel technology is without really considering some of the broader implications. So
Yes.
that's sort of where we're trying to ask these questions now before they get a little bit too out of hand. And that's a good example of a decision made to try to do one thing, which is to have a benefit to the food safety piece, and maybe storage is greatly improved by better packaging, and that helps reduce food waste. So that's an excellent goal. But alongside that, we have an additional packaging issue, and then we have plastics waste and plastics problems. So yeah, it's tricky.
Case by case scenario. That's it. That
Mm.
has to be
Mm.
done on a case by case scenario. Rachel, thank you so much. You've been very informative, and I look forward reading your next research. This was great, and thank you for being on Raw Green.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thanks for the really excellent questions, and also looking forward to trying to figure out more of these answers together.
Wonderful. You take care. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Raw Green, brought to you by Obi, a sustainability consultancy firm specialized in life cycle assessment and decarbonization strategies. If you're looking to make an impact, a tangible and measurable one, reach out to us on our website at oneob.com or visit our social media. Links below in the description. See you at the next episode. Ciao.